Okay.
It's not working for me. Okay, here we go. I think we are on Facebook, and I think we're recording to the cloud. And so
Yes,
we
you
are set. We are recording to the cloud for subsequent viewing on YouTube. So here is the story of Noah, at least one of the stories of Noah. Actually, it's a story of God, according to the book we're reading. And this is from the OHV, otherwise known as the original Hebrew version, done by Brian Bull and Fritz.
Original hearers version.
Original hearers version, there we go. Not original Hebrews version, original hearers version. Brian Bull, Fritz, and I gather that Bernard Taylor had some consulting role in all of this. So here it goes. When people began to multiply on the face of the ground, and daughters were born to them, Elohim's sons saw that they were beautiful. So they took wives for them of whomever they chose. Then the Lord, all through this is Yahweh, and Brian and Fritz have separated out the Yahweh stories and the Elohim stories. So we have two flood stories, just like we have two creation stories. So all of these, when I say Yahweh, when I say Lord, it means Yahweh. Then the Lord said, my spirit will not abide in humans indefinitely, for they are flesh. Let their days be 120 years. The Nephilim were in the land in those days, and also afterward, when Elohim's sons mated with the women who bore them children. These were the heroes of old, warriors of renown. The Lord saw the wickedness of the humans was great in the land, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil all the time. The Lord was sorry that he made humankind on the land, and it pained his heart. So the Lord said, I will eliminate from the ground the human beings I have created, the people along with animals and creeping things and birds of the sky, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Then the Lord told Noah, go into the ark, you and all your household, for I have seen that you alone in this generation are righteous before me. Take with you 7 pairs of all the clean animals, the male and its mate, and a pair of the animals that are not clean, the male and its mate, and 7 pairs of the birds of the sky, also, male and female, to keep their kind alive on the face of all the land. For in 7 days I will send rain on the land for 40 days and 40 nights, and every living thing that I have made I will erase from the face of the ground. And Noah did everything that the Lord had commanded him, and the Lord shut him in. And after 7 days, the water of the flood came on the land. The rain fell on the land 40 days and 40 nights. The flood continued 40 days on the land, and the waters increased and bore up the ark, and it rose high above the land. The waters rose and increased greatly on the land, and the ark floated on the surface of the water. The waters rose so much on the land that all the high mountains under the whole sky were covered. The water rose above the mountains, covering them 15 cubits deep. Everything on dry land in whose nostrils was the breath of life died. He blotted out everything alive on the face of the ground, human beings and animals and creeping things and birds of the sky. They were blotted out from the land. Only Noah was left and those who were with him in the ark. At the end of 40 days, Noah opened the window of the ark he had made and sent out a dove to see if the water had subsided from the face of the ground. But the dove found no place to set its foot, and it returned to him in the ark, for the water was still on the surface of the land. So he put out his hand, took it in, and brought it into the ark with him. He waited another 7 days and again sent out the dove from the ark, and the dove came back to him in the evening, and there was in its beak a freshly plucked olive leaf. So Noah knew that the waters had subsided from the land. Then he waited another 7 days and sent out the dove, and it did not return to him anymore. Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked and saw that the face of the ground was firm. Now Noah built an altar to the Lord and took of every clean animal and of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And when the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, he said in his heart, I will never curse the ground again because of humanity, because the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth. Nor will I ever again destroy every living creature as I have done. As long as the land endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. All right, let's begin with prayer. Dear God, we are thankful for these old stories that somehow have come down to us through the efforts of many people over thousands of years. Help us to be wise when we read them. It's easy for us to say, well, that's what they believed, and we have to believe the same thing too. Or we can say, this is what we believe, and we can't possibly believe what they said. But there must be a third path between these extremes, and we hope that we can find it. Help us to be particularly wary of interpreting misfortune to people's waywardness. We live this side of Jesus, who said the rain and the sunshine fall on the good and the bad alike. But the blind man was not blind because of his sin or his father's or mother's. That the tower on whom the people on whom the tower fell and the people who were killed in the temples cut down by the soldiers, they were no more evil or good than anyone else. So help us to be cautious about blaming people for their misfortunes. We pray in Christ's name. Amen. Okay, over to Brian Bull with regrets that Fritz Guy can't be with us again. I owe a lot, both personally and professionally, to Fritz, and I hope sometime he can look at this video and hear my gratitude and the gratitude of others toward him. He has contributed much to our church. He often describes himself as the old guy. And I think we need to listen to Bronwyn Larson. She says, don't say old guy, she says older guy. So we're all older. None of us is old, we're all older. And I think Fritz Guy needs to take that into account as well. But we're glad that Brian can be here representing the book, and we look forward to what he has to say. So over to you, Brian.
Thank you, David. What I'd like to do to start is what I did last week, because I think it was very helpful. And I'd like to remind people of the two helpers that Fritz and I actually came across as this book, the second book in the series, came to be now. Can you see that? Is
yes,
my
there it is.
Yeah, it's my shared screen showing up.
Right. There's Moshe.
There's Moshe. All right, let's see if, yeah, I can't get Moshe. Try once more. There we go. All right, you can see Moshe now, I presume.
Yes.
All right, this is Moshe. We refer to him on many times in the course of book 2 and book 3. We found him so useful that we pushed him further back into book 1. So I talked about him last week. But actually, in the books themselves, he and Ian Michael, and there's Ian Michael O'Dern, representing us as moderns, and he looks appropriately a little bit dazed. The two of them together, so one a representative of the worldview of those who first heard Genesis, the other a representative of the worldview of those of us today who read it. And now we've done what is conceptually probably impossible, but we've got the two of them together. We can do things with cartoons that we can't do in real life. So Moshe is reading the text of Genesis and imagining, understanding, picturing what the text of Genesis says. And over his shoulder, Ian Michael, and that would be us, is looking at that same text and is perplexed by it. How could God kill everybody, men, women, and children, for some curiously vague misdemeanor? Now, this picture is there to remind us that Genesis was written to Moshe. It was a text addressed to him. It was a text to answer his questions. It's a text that refers to events that occurred in his world. We read it, Ian Michael in this case representing us, as if it were an email that had been forwarded on to us. It is very valuable for us. The fact that it wasn't written to us does not by any means, or should not by any means, convey to us that it's not appropriate for us to read it and profit from it. But it is a forwarded email. It was written originally to Moshe, and we're looking over Moshe's shoulder. Here is what Ian Michael sees and what Moshe sees as they both read the same text. Moshe sees a world in which there is a rakia, a dome, a firmament that protects the living space from the water that was there before creation began. Underneath that dome, or plastered onto the underside of it, in Moshe's mind would be the sun, the moon, and the stars, and underneath it were trees and plants and land. The underside of the dome, Moshe knew as sky. The ground underneath his feet, the land that was promised. Above the dome, there would be water. It's referred to in Genesis, and we're going to hear about it a lot today, the Tehom. It was the waters of chaos that had been segregated by God away from the world in which Moshe lived, but they were always there sitting above the sky and ready, as Moshe understood, at any time to break through again, just as they had at the time of the flood. Underneath the land that Moshe walked on was something that Moshe didn't fully comprehend. It was Sheol, and he wasn't quite sure how that related to his world, except that it probably wasn't a really good and cheerful thing. So the Genesis story, to the people who first heard it, to Moshe and his kin, was a story about how their sky and their land had come into existence. And then today, how that sky and land had been threatened and almost taken out of existence again by a great flood. Ian Michael, when he reads Genesis, thinks that it's going to tell him about Earth, the planet, which is sitting here, how the universe came into existence. That would be the heavens, the starry heavens? Did the universe come into existence before the solar system? Did they arrive simultaneously? Or did the solar system get inserted into the universe a few thousand years ago? Those are the kinds of questions that Ian Michael is going to Genesis to find the answers to. He doesn't realize that the story that he is reading was addressed to Moshe, and it was designed to answer Moshe's questions of how the sky and the land had come to be. And today what we're going to talk about is how Moshe's sky and Moshe's land were threatened by a great flood. We're not going to talk about a sphere of earth that now has an additional shell of water around it that's reshaping continents, that came from somewhere and goes somewhere else, not entirely clear, but that's the kind of mental pictures that Ian Michael has in his mind, and it's for answers to those pictures that he's going to go to Genesis. And with that, we will return to the book. And yes, David, what is question number 1? Where has David gone?
Well, I'd like to know a little bit more about Moshe.
All right.
I'm thinking of him, see if this is right. He's a farmer, and most of what he grows is for his own family, but he grows a little more that he can take to the market. So every so often he loads his ox cart up and he heads to the market and sells his things. But when he's there, he discovers that there are other people selling their things at the market too. Some of them have come as far away as from Egypt. Others have come away from what we might call Lebanon, Syria, Iran, Iraq, up that way. And the people from Egypt bring their flood stories, and the people from the north bring their flood stories. So Moshe has these other stories in mind, and he wants to compare his story with their stories. And so Ian, as he looks over Moshe's shoulder, he needs to look beyond the text and see the other stories that were also of interest to Moshe. What do you think?
Yeah, fair enough. You've got Moshe as far more knowledgeable about ancient Near Eastern flood stories than we addressed in the book. But remember, what we were attempting to deal with at the time was the disconnect between the Genesis account as usually read and science as commonly understood. And so it was this story that was the problem and maybe the solution. And it's this story that is often brought into the conversation to explain why things do not look as if they are only a few thousand years old, and why the fossil record does not look as if all animals and plants and every living thing came into existence during a week's time a few thousand years ago. It was that question and the use of this particular flood story to explain the scientific incongruities that Fritz and I were tackling.
Okay, and one of the terms you use throughout is the term explanacept. Is that pronounced correctly?
Yes.
If not, how about pronouncing it correctly for us and then explain what that means? Because it's a key word in all of your books, I think.
Yes, it is. And it is the realization that in order to understand and make some progress in this dilemma, we needed to be able to think about how we thought. Thinking about how you think is difficult. It is seldom undertaken. And after trying it and working with it for several years, we came to understand why it's very seldom attempted. But in this case, it's essential. So we think with explanacepts. Everything that happens to us that comes into our mind gets categorized as it belongs in this large category or that large category. The number of explanacepts available to the people who first heard the Genesis story were the number was limited to the number 2. Everything that happened was either God's actions, a result of God's actions, or human actions. Now, the human actions included the actions of animals. Obviously, they didn't think that God pulled the dishes off the table if a dog came along, grabbed the tablecloth and yanked. And the divine explanacept included things like angels, devils, divine beings. But with that minor modification, they only had 2 explanacepts, and they accounted for everything. So in the flood story, because humans didn't do it or couldn't do it, it was an unimaginable catastrophe, they had to attribute it to God. That was the only other explanacept in their minds. We read the story, and we have a third explanacept in our mind. You may recall that when I pointed out the mental constructs of Ian Michael, I pointed out the globe, the world, and said that he imagines that a shell of water covered the entire globe. That is what he presumably means when he talks about a global flood. A global flood would have made no sense whatever to the persons who first heard the story, to Moshe, because they didn't know they lived on a globe. They thought they lived on a flat land with a rakia, a firmament above it that had water above it. And that was their picture. And that's how they read the story of Genesis. So they read Genesis with 2 explanacepts in their mind. We read it with 3. And therein lies the problem. It's the way our minds work with our explanacepts and the way their minds worked with theirs that accounts for this discontinuity that so plagues us.
Could you give us some examples from the Bible that you use in your book that shows how the people of biblical times, at least this portion of biblical times, would attribute to God things that we probably wouldn't?
Yes, many of the curious things that happened in the Old Testament would fall into that category. You recall that as the children of Israel were journeying from Egypt to Mount Sinai, they murmured against Moses and said, "Look, we had lots of meat to eat in Egypt, and we had onions to put on the meat to make it even tastier. And you brought us out here into the desert to die. We'd rather go back to Egypt and have meat to eat and be slaves than die in the desert." I think I'm paraphrasing fairly closely. And Moses said, "The Lord's going to send you meat and bread to eat." And the next morning, the quail arrived in huge numbers, and manna was on the ground. So now they had both bread, manna, and they had meat to eat, and they were happy. About 2 years or a year and a half later, it's not entirely clear because of trying to harmonize the accounts in Exodus and Numbers, but about 18 months later, it appears, the Lord sent quail for them to eat again, but this time they died while the quail was still between their teeth. So now they have a real problem. They've got a God who sends quail once, and it's to their benefit, and they praise him for it, and sends quail again, and they don't know what to do with it because it's poisonous, and they die when they eat it. But with only two explanacepts, and because the human explanacept isn't going to cut the mustard here, they have to attribute this to God. And so they do. And those that die were buried in a place called something like Kibroth Hattaroth, or graves of those who craved. That's a classic illustration of an event that had to be attributed to God, just like the flood, because humans could not have brought it about.
But you're going to continue the story, right?
Well, I answered your question. What's your next one?
No, you have an understanding what happened that doesn't necessarily require God's direct intervention with regard to the people eating quail.
Oh, certainly. Those quail still actually come in their flocks. They're called the European migratory quail, and they fly across the Mediterranean, and they breed and nest in sub-Saharan Africa. Then they fly back again across the Mediterranean to Europe. Well, the Mediterranean's a pretty big body of water, and at the end of that flight, as they were coming south, they would be extremely fatigued, and they could be very easily, they still can today, be knocked out of the air with clubs. And so they still come, and they still turn out on some occasions to be poisonous. And they have been tracked back to a series of islands in the Mediterranean. There are islands that surround the island of Lesbos, and there is a plant that in September, roughly speaking, it's called the Red Dead Nettle. I haven't looked at that for a while. And the seeds contain an alkaloid that is harmless to avian muscle, to the muscle of birds, but it's quite poisonous to human and mammalian muscle. And if you eat the quail that have stopped off in the island and eaten large quantities of these seeds, and their bodies contain this alkaloid, it causes myolysis in people that eat the quail. That is, this skeletal muscle dissolves, and the myoglobin, the protein in the muscle, goes to the kidneys and plugs the kidney tubules. Well, nowadays, if that happens, although people are pretty wary about eating them if they come across in the wrong time of year, but those people are simply taken to a nearby hospital, put on kidney dialysis, and usually do fine. But kidney dialysis was not available to the children of Israel, and I wasn't dealing with their physical problems. I was dealing with their theological problems.
Yes, but as I understand it, Moshe and people like him would say, well, God sent us quail that we could eat successfully, and then God sent us quail that killed us. Both. God did both, but it's possible to provide an explanation of this that Ian would find persuasive, namely that the birds migrate there quite regularly, but sometimes they stop off and eat things that will kill the people when they arrive. So you have Ian's explanation and Moshe's explanation of the same event, correct?
Yeah, Moshe's explanation was that humans, the only other explanacept that he had to deal with, that humans had precipitated God's anger by fussing.
Now, I take it that another good illustration of this that I found in the book was the issue of gambling or casting lots and how that engaged the people.
Okay, it's and that is presented in this book, but I think I've mentioned it before. In Proverbs 16:33, it says, the lot is cast into the lap, but Jehovah controls the outcome. Doesn't say anything about, and this of course is the casting of lots, which was a common practice throughout all of Old Testament times, up and to including the time of Christ, because the disciples cast lots to determine who the replacement for Judas was going to be. Well, if you only have two explanacepts, then it's an interesting world in which you can force God to speak by taking what happens out of the realm of human control. And so the casting of lots was the casting of dice, although at the time of Christ, what we think happened was that they had some writing on broken pieces of pottery, and they threw these down, and however they arranged themselves was given. That was how they determined what God wanted them to do. So the casting of lots was used throughout all Old Testament times when God's direction was needed, but God was not speaking. And that's how the children of Israel determined which tribes were going to go where, which ones would get the choicest locations where there was water, and which ones ended up in the near desert or across the Jordan even. So this text means, as near as we can interpret it today, that they really truly believed that there were only two active agents in their world, and if you took it out of the realm of human activity, it necessarily went into the realm of God's activity.
Can I ask
Okay, Forrest can't give himself permission to speak, so I'll give himself permission to speak.
Thank you again, Dr. Bull. I have a question. Even if this story is true, and I think there's some questions about it, and even if there are only two explanations, surely God could have entered into this thing and said, don't eat these quail at this time. Instead, he allowed them to. So what is that saying about God? It's more of a theodicy, this natural explanation of what was happening. Am I going off the deep end on that, or what?
No, it's a perfectly valid question, but it is going to take us somewhat far afield from the flood.
Okay, okay.
Was the assigned topic for this morning, but it's a very good question. So, questions about the flood?
Okay, I take it in principle,
Well,
I take that in principle, many of the things that are attributed to God in the Bible, we would attribute to more natural regularities, as you call them. I like that you call them natural regularities rather than natural laws. I think that's a real advance in how to think about these things. But in principle, we could find some explanation for at least many of these things on the basis of natural regularities. You leave some room for miracles, so you don't insist that everything has to be explained in principle by natural regularities, but you do leave some room for miracles, don't you?
yes, but that too is going to require a little bit of explanation. But it may puzzle many of the people that are listening as to where we are in the story of the flood. So theologically, where we are is, how can we attribute to God a catastrophe that was unimaginably, that killed, as the story is told, everybody in the world, men, women, children, and pretty much all of the animals, and destroyed many of the plants. How can that be attributed to God? That's the theological problem. And yet God not only claims credit for it before he does it, he claims credit for having done it afterwards. And so the theological problem here, the scientific problem, of course, is, can the flood really account for the changes in the Earth's surface? Can it account for the geological column? Can it account for speciation? Can it account for how creatures that live only in one country and whose fossils are found only in one country could get to the ark, be saved, and then get back to wherever it is, such as the kangaroos in Australia? All of those questions have been attributed to the flood. But the theological question is, how can God be held responsible for the greatest, if the story is to be interpreted literally, the greatest genocide in history?
Okay, I'd like to, I'm sorry, I interrupted
No,
you.
go ahead. Go ahead.
I'd like to come back to that just really quickly, but I would think that one of the things we would like to say is that in Moshe's explanacept, the distinction between a person being guilty and the whole family, and indeed all of the person's animals as well, being guilty for what one person in the tribe did, was pretty widespread. It's not till we get down to Ezekiel that we get the idea that each person is responsible for what he or she does. So that's a different way in which Moshe's explanacept doesn't coincide with ours entirely. Now back to the flood, unless you want to say something about that.
Well, which direction would you like me to go in?
Okay, let's talk about put it this way. Could Ian come up with an explanation of what happened at the flood using only natural regularities?
Well, that's what's been attempted ever since the rise of science. Natural regularities have been invoked to explain how the flood waters could have laid down the geological column. As some people present here will know only too well, ecological zonation has been called in to help. And that is that the reason that the geological column has certain creatures at the bottom and then other creatures above it and still other creatures above that, and eventually dinosaurs and then finally mammals and man, was because these creatures lived at different altitudes on the Earth's surface. And as the flood waters came up, they first buried one creature, and then they buried another set of creatures, and then a third set of creatures. And that accounts for the geologic column as we see it. There are geological reasons why that isn't going to work. Partly it's because there are microfossils in each of the layers that characterize the layers. And the microfossils, of course, would presumably be mixed up by the floodwaters and would be present throughout all of the layers. But it's these microfossils that enable people drilling for oil to determine where in the geologic column they've come to, because they just get a little tiny piece of the rock that they're drilling through, and they can tell where in the geologic column they are, and then they know how far they have to go to get to where they were intending to get to. So the flood has been brought into the discussion to explain all of these things in terms of a short chronology, and the standard all animals came into existence during 1 week of time. So that's the reason that the flood enters into this discord between Genesis and science.
Now, I would say that the chapter that you and Fritz wrote on flood geology is more emphatic in tone than the other chapters, or so it seemed to me. And you are quite clear that flood geology is a bad idea, and that the sooner we stop investing money in it, the better, and that there is no way it can be improved. That is, flood geology has not yet come up with an acceptable model, and in principle, there's no way that flood geology could. So you're very definitive on this. I would say a little more so than in the other chapters. Do you want to explain how you feel so strongly about it?
Well, both of us have had friends who have spent their lives addressing this question, and we're sorry that they didn't accomplish what they set out to accomplish, and we'd much rather have seen them undertake something else. So it's human capital, which I gather is a buzzword nowadays. It's the waste of human capital that bothers us.
Okay. Now back to the flood. You mentioned several places. I can't quite find them here. The Bosphorus, the Kosker Cave, and the Storiga Slide. Is that right? How do those fit into your understanding of all this?
Well, they're not anything. You will note that we were far less definite about that than about flood geology and its lack of verifiability or its lack of utility. That wasn't really part of the book. That was an afterword. And we were just saying, since flood stories come from nations, countries, and peoples around the world, whatever the flood was that came down to that ended up being enshrined in this story in the Bible, it had to have been very widespread. And we were looking at several of the suggestions that have been made by others. And that's where these particular specific ideas came from.
Could you be a little more detailed, for instance, about the Bosphorus? How does that figure into the story?
Well, there was a very interesting book by two authors called Ryan and Pittman. Came out about 1995, I think, or 96, in which they created a scenario in which they explained that at some point in the past, probably several thousand years ago, the Bosphorus was breached by the Mediterranean as it rose, as the ice melted after the last ice age. Now that melting started about 18,000 years ago. It finished maybe about 8,000 years ago. But as the melting occurred, what had been a lake into which the Danube River had entered and supplied the water for, a freshwater lake, that lake had been flooded as the Mediterranean rose and eventually breached the natural dam that was the Bosphorus. And they wrote this book claiming that this could well have been where the flood stories came from, because we know that wheat was domesticated somewhere there in Turkey, and there's a very, very early temple built on a hill also surrounding the Black Sea. And so they went and drilled holes in the bottom of the Black Sea. And the Black Sea is interesting because it has freshwater top and a saltwater bottom. And there is still salt water flowing over the Bosphorus into the bottom of the Black Sea. And there's fresh water coming in from the rivers that flows out over the top into the Mediterranean. It's brackish, of course. But if you look at the creatures in the bottom, it looks like it was at one point a freshwater lake that has now become a saltwater body of water. Well, this was an attempt to use the explanacepts with which Ian Michael is equipped, natural phenomena, to explain a flood that would have been first read by people who only had two explanacepts. So it's people with three explanacept minds reading a story that was first heard by people with two explanacept thought processes. Does that help?
Okay, then is it the Kosker Cave? How does one pronounce that? C-O-S? Go ahead.
Yeah, it's the Kosker Cave. It's fascinating because it's a cave that is still above sea level, but the water has come halfway up the paintings on the wall. And the entrance drops 151 feet, I think, down under the ocean. And it seems that the only possible explanation for that is that the cave was entered by humans who decorated the walls. There's pictures of human hands. The way these human hands were were put on the wall, they're negative images. And it looks very much as though the early inhabitants of Europe got into this cave on dry land, climbed up 150 feet, got to this cave, and then they had iron oxide or some other mineral pigment in their mouths. And so they spray painted their hands. They blew this iron oxide onto the wall to show that they had been there. So you have these hand images, large numbers of them actually, big ones and little ones, and so this was sort of graffiti before people could write. And then when the ocean levels rose, they rose probably about 300 feet. So 150 feet is would have meant that there was way more dry land than we think of just between London and Paris. I had a French friend, and I was talking with him about this because he was very pleased that this cave had been discovered. And I said, back then, when the sea levels were lower, you could have walked on dry land from Paris to London. And his wife's response was, but who would want to do that? But in any event, as the sea levels rose, the water came up almost to obliterate these paintings, and now it's stopped. Fortunately, before they were completely obliterated. There does not appear to be any other way of getting into this cave, and I think there's been several fatalities from divers going down and trying to get into the cave. And I understand the French government has now cast a concrete bulwark over the entrance to the cave. So it's hopeless to go down there and try to enter it. But that appears to be just proof that the sea level rose at least 150 feet within the time that human beings were going around and painting pictures on cave walls.
Okay, I see Bob Ford wants to jump in here. Bob, just before he does, could I ask you to comment on the Storega slide or Storega slide? What's the right way to say that?
I don't know. I've never heard anyone pronounce it. I've only seen it in writing. There was a huge landslide off of the coast of Norway, and that produced a tsunami that probably would have been on the order of at least 150 feet high. And there is some reason to believe that that might have been the final event that separated England from Europe, because as some of you who have traveled that know only too well, it's very shallow in spots. And there are obviously places where people had boat building operations in the shallow parts of the sea that are now flooded. So something, when this slide occurred, there would have been a huge tsunami, and it was just simply a possible explanation, along with the Ryan and Pittman one and several others, of the kinds of things that might have given rise to flood stories in Egypt and Assyria and the whole of the ancient Near East, as well as everywhere else on the earth.
Okay, thank you very much. Forrest, is that okay if we let Bob in?
Yeah, let Bob, you go in.
Yeah, just a quick description of another example similar to what you're talking, Brian. I worked for a year as a consultant for the environmental agency in Abu Dhabi. And one of the scientists that I was working with was doing underwater archaeological research in the Persian Gulf. Now, the Persian Gulf is only a little over 100 feet deep at its deepest point. So when the oceans were lower, below that 150 feet that you're talking about, in previous when periods when the ocean was a lot lower because there was more ice in the northern hemisphere and all across North America and so on, they're now finding remnants of former cities and temples that are now buried under the Persian Gulf. So if we look at the flood story as a description of a regional event, and if you lived around the edges of, or in that valley, which is an extension of the Mesopotamian valleys where the Tigris and Euphrates come, and when they, at one time when the oceans were lower, those rivers would have gone all the way out around the point, that very important strait there, the Strait of Hormuz. It would be very credible and reasonable for Moshe to say, well, this was a calamity that affected the whole world, because that was his world. And so it seems to me, you know, and the science is telling us, yes, the Persian Gulf at one time was empty and it got flooded. And we can actually they are actually finding archaeological ruins down there. Have you looked at that part of the story?
Yes, and I think your synthesis is a very excellent summary of what is known. The Bible itself suggests this because it gives 4 rivers in Eden, 2 of which are the Tigris and the Euphrates, 2 of which probably were rivers in this extension of the Persian Gulf. And satellite imagery shows several fairly good candidates for the remaining rivers that flowed out of Eden. And
in fact, I was there. Some of you know that I'm a geographer, and one of the specialties I've worked on is satellite imagery. And there was a whole office in the agency I was working with that looked at what are called wadis in that part of the world, now dry riverbeds that could have been the upper portions of those rivers that are now underneath the, and they connect 2 canyons that go down into the canyon. So it's all very explainable using modern scientific methods, particularly, as you say, satellite imagery and archaeology, geology. It's very, very explainable. Yeah.
Thank you. I think you've done a remarkable job of bringing a lot of information to bear upon the question of what was being described at the time of the flood. But today, what I thought we were going to discuss were the theological implications of God wiping out the entire human race. And why that might have been.
Yeah. In fact, that's where I wanted to go. I say, if we look at the science, you look at it as Ian Michael does, I think we can explain it. If we look at it as Moshe does, his only explanation, as you say, is God had to do it.
Exactly.
So where does that leave us today with understanding who God is and what he does and doesn't do and why he does it?
Well, let's work on that a little bit. Couldn't Ian just say, God didn't do it? I know that it happened for other reasons, and we understand that Moshe believed that, but we don't believe that, and there's no reason why we should believe it. And so it's a little tricky because even now at church, somebody will be healed by chemotherapy, right? And then people will pray in church, thank you, Lord, for healing so-and-so, even though it has been done with natural remedies. But couldn't one option, what are the options? One would be to say, God didn't do it. Another option would be to say that God did it. God did it, secondly, and we don't know why. And a third option would be to say God did it, and we do know why. We can explain it. We can talk about how evil the people were and so forth. So now the whole question of theodicy comes in here, and it seems like both Brian and Bob want to push us in that direction, so we can explore that. But I guess the more immediate question is, does Ian have to believe that God did it?
Now this is why we have spent so much time and written 3 books about the necessity for realizing how these documents, which after all do undergird our belief in God, and we certainly would want to say that they prepared humankind for the coming of the Messiah. So we can't just simply walk away and say, well, that's nonsense. We have to deal with the concept of God that comes to us from ancient times. That's the Old Testament. That's why we have it. As a scientist, obviously, I'm concerned about how to explain the inexplicably, the scientifically inexplicable statements that are made in the first chapter of the Bible, which I firmly believe to be an explanation of a nation that was learning early. It was early in their journey of learning about who God is and what God does and what God wants. But because it was early, it has some difficulties that we need to explain, but we certainly don't want to walk away from it, which is, I don't think what you were suggesting, but were you?
Speaking to me?
Yes.
Oh, no. I'll hazard what I think, but do you want to, what do you in your heart of hearts think about this? I'll hazard something along these lines, but do you want to?
No, you go ahead, and because you're the theologian, I'm the scientist.
Well, okay, I'll give it a try. Ian needs to understand that Moshe is thinking of his story in light of and in contest with other flood stories in the region. And if we look at that, we can say to Ian, that story is better, although it's inadequate from our point of view, that story is better than some of the other stories in the area. So it represents a real advance over the other options there. After all, being a farmer, Moshe knew Canaanite people nearby. They were his neighbors, and he talked to them about this sort of thing. So it's a real advance in his time. But for us, the story has continued. So the Bible is a process, and you talk a lot about this in your book, how you use the word development and process. I would say the Bible is a movie, and it's a story that continues, and this story is early on, and it represents an advance over what was otherwise available then, but the story has continued to the point that we are on this side of Jesus, and we would not say ourselves some of the things they said. So we can respect, and I think I'm just echoing your book, we can respect Moshe's understanding of the flood as an improvement of the alternatives he had, while also saying that we need to improve on Moshe's understanding of it as time goes on. And it's important not to eliminate these early stories, because it's only with these stories we can plot the direction of the way the story is moving, and it's only in this way that we can push the story further in the same direction. So we should not go against the Bible, but we should go beyond the Bible in the same direction the Bible is moving. So that's how I would hazard it. What do you think?
Superb. I'll sign on to that. Where do I sign up?
Okay. George has something here about two arcs, and others have raised their hands. It seems to me we ought to take a break and then jump into the discussion with other people taking the lead. I see Rodney wants to say something. Who else?
Gerald Winslow has his hand up.
Okay, Gerald and George Tichy.
George.
Those three I know had something to say. And
Peter
Peter has something to say. Who else? I'm going to scroll down the way here to see if there's anybody else. Terry, did you want to say something? I don't get a response from him.
I may have a question later.
Okay, so let's put you on the queue. Let's see who else might have something he or she wants to say. Okay, I would like to call on some of you, but I won't do that because I'm going to respect your decision not to speak up. But I do think a lot of you that I can see out there have something to add to this conversation. So let's take 10 minutes. I will turn off the recording on YouTube, but I will leave on the Facebook one for reasons that I don't need to go into detail. So you will see that we're no longer recording on for YouTube, but we are still on Facebook. So you can say whatever you want, but realize that other people can participate in the discussion too. See you in 10 minutes. That would be about 11:45 California time.
Okay, and anyone that wants to ask a question, if you'd raise your hand.